Welcome to the Landlord Lease Podcast, a training course for landlords to understand how to create a lease. Sponsored by veteranlandlord.com. And now your host, Edward O'Daniel.
Hello, landlords. Welcome back to the Landlord Lease Podcast, sponsored by the veteranlandlord.com. My name is Edward O'Daniel. I'll be your host for the show and just want to welcome you back here. This is actually going to be the last installment of the Landlord Lease Podcast. I created the podcast because I wanted to make information available to landlords regarding lease and lease terms and how they can structure that better to make it more secure and more profitable for them. But we're going to be going over the last of the lease terms on this episode. So on this episode, we will be covering security deposits, severability, subleasing, terms of the lease, the use of the premises, utilities, and we will be covering a vehicles clause regarding this. So let's kind of get started with the security deposit. So right now, the security deposit should, this clause right here should clearly define just how much, for instance, the security deposit you're charging. Not only that, what the security deposit will be used for. Because security deposits are, I've found, have been very different state by state. Please check with your local state laws regarding this and an attorney about how people are allowed to use security deposits because they're different, okay, from state to state. And I don't want to have anything, or I don't want to give you guys anything on this podcast that's going to go against that or that's going to get you guys into trouble. But technically for security deposits, you should have how much they're paying for the security deposit listed. What are some of the things? Make sure that security deposits are going to be used for any items that are not normal wear and tear. Again, that could be other things. Security deposits, depending on your state, may actually be used for other things. Sometimes they're not. For instance, let's just say if they have a $1,000 security deposit, I'm just throwing out a number here. And let's just say that they left the house in great shape, right? They cleaned it, everything else is in great shape, but they left owing you rent or utility bills or something, it could be late fees that they owed or something else that are on there. Sometimes you're allowed to, depending on your state, use a security deposit to cover other charges on their account. Some states you're not. So please make sure you understand this. Depending upon your state, you allocate in the security deposit what your deposit can be used for what repairs and what charges and so forth inside of the security deposit clause. Okay, but definitely make sure you keep track of how much the security deposit is. And by any means here, please do not do this. Okay, even if your state allows it, just please don't do this. I have seen landlords use a security deposit for if people, for instance, are late on their rent or they have charges. We talked about charges, maintenance and charges in another episode of the podcast. But what happens, if they break something or damage something over there? Do not use the security deposit as a mechanism to pay for that, because then they're going to have to, the residents are going to have to give you more security deposit back. Your security deposit is there to protect you as a landlord, to hold some money in there for whenever they move out, to protect against damages. The last thing you want to do is chip away at that money for this charge, that rent charge, this charge, to where there's zero security deposit whenever they move out. And now you have to eat the full cost or go after them with collections to try to get your money. So please do not use security deposit for any other fines. I've had landlords do that and it's always bitten them in the long run here. So if a tenant needs to pay for something, then that's something that they need to pay for that month. And the security deposit is not used for that. Okay. Next, we're going to talk about is severability. I didn't really understand this. I had to actually ask the attorney what this meant from time to time. But basically, here's what severability means, sort of in layman's terms in a nutshell. Some things that if the governing law, which again we covered in another podcast, finds that any part of your lease to be invalid or unlawful, the severability just means that just because that one clause or that one thing is unlawful, it does not invalidate the entire lease. So that's what severability means. So if that one part of the lease is not valid by law, then that one piece is not going to be applied to you, but all the other parts of the lease will be. And having a severability clause is what protects you from that. So again, I had to ask about that. I couldn't really explain that when people were asking. So subleasing. Subleasing is just something, depending on your area, you may or may not allow this. I know in my particular area, I do not allow subleasing. I do not like it because I have no control as a landlord over who the person puts in there. Now, when you rent a place out and you market it and you get applications for the property, you go through the tenant screening process, which if you're interested in that, there's another tenant screening podcast that I'm doing, so you can look that up. But if you're going through that screening process, you're going to find out about that applicant, their, maybe their credit score, their background, their payment history, their rental history, employment verification. Well, the problem is whenever some of the resident in their subleases that they can put anybody they want in there. That's their choice. They don't necessarily have to run it by you. So some areas I know that I've seen like on TV shows, I've never really experienced it, like New York, you have an apartment and then you're allowed to sublease it to other people. That may be the case. And if that's valid in your area, then fine, but put some of the other rules and regulations involving subleasing where, they have to get your authorization to sublease it, or they have to screen the person if it's going to be subleased, or if the person's moving out and it's going to be subleased, then why does the person still want to, the resident still want to have a lease with you? Why not just terminate their lease and then move the other person in? So all these things kind of need to be understood about subleasing, but this is going to be completely up to you. Please check in your area if it's allowed. And if it is or is not, make sure you put just, no subleasing allowed without management's permission or landlord's permission, or just no subleasing allowed. Just make sure it's clearly defined. Moving on, the term of the lease. Again, this is just pretty straightforward. The term of the lease just means when's the lease start date, when is the end date of the lease going to be. That's all it is. So it's just simply a quick description of, the lease starts on this date and it ends on this date, and that's all it defines. Pretty straightforward. You're going to see the term of the lease is pretty much one of the first clauses you have of your lease, like along with the rent and late fees and security deposit. Those things typically fall on the first page of a lease because those are the things that are most important to populate of a lease. So next thing, the use of premises. The use of premises is really kind of there to help. Again, it's another clause that's there to support how people are to use the residence. So the use of these premises are to be used as a residential home. They're not to be used, for instance, in the form of a business, which we did talk about in another episode. Just none of those things can happen. The use of this premises is to be used as a home, as a residential dwelling, and that's really about it. So it's just, again, used to reinforce what the property can be used for and how the resident is going to be using it. Next thing is just going to be utilities. Utilities are going to be, again, one of those clauses that should be like pretty close to the first page, but the utilities are going to include things like what utilities are included with the rent or which ones are not. So you can just say utilities included with this lease are this. And then basically you can also say the resident therefore responsible for these utilities. So you're just very clear about which ones are paid for with the rent, which ones are the resident's responsibility, and then what was to happen. For instance, our utility clause says things like utilities must be maintained throughout the life of the lease. For instance, we've had people in our area actually turn off the gas, which is heating, which primarily uses for heat in the summertime. Like they'll stop the gas when it gets warmer and they just won't have hot water because they don't want to pay a gas bill, and then they'll turn it back on in the wintertime. Well, that's not allowed. And you can put that in your lease that utilities must be maintained throughout the entire lease term to make sure that it's sanitary condition. Because I mean, if they don't have hot water, then they can't really clean things very well either. So those are just things that need to go in the utilities area. And just what happens, if they don't have the utilities turned on, then again, they're in default of their lease. And then you could use that in terms of potentially kicking them out if they do that. Now, the last clause we're going to talk about here today is vehicle clause. Again, pretty straightforward. If they fill out a rental application, part of the rental application process defines what vehicles these people own. Now, you want to do something like that because you want to know what vehicles they belong to. You want to know the color, make, model, even the license plates for those vehicles, because you want to make sure that nobody's parking their vehicles or illegally, parking them by the property without you knowing, whose authorized vehicles are allowed to be there or not. Believe it or not, there have been residents that I've had that have actually parked commercial vehicles or allowed people to park commercial vehicles in their driveways and collected money off of it. And that's not really going to be allowed. Those type of things, you don't want to have people parking their vehicles, and because this kind of case, it could be a fine with the city of parking those vehicles, in the wrong places. So a vehicle clause just simply says, here are the vehicles that are authorized and allowed to be in the property. So landlords, I really, truly hope you got a lot out of this series for the Landlord Lease podcast, that you've enjoyed it, and that you've got at least several good gold nuggets that you can go back, recreate your lease, think about your lease a little bit better. I would urge you, go to veteranlandlord.com, create a free account on there, look at our document libraries, utilize the resources we have for you. Our goal at the Veteran Landlord and a part of this podcast is to educate you, to help you grow your business, to be more effective, more profitable, and to just really streamline it and just make it easier for you to grow and be financially free. Guys, thanks so much for tuning into the podcast. I really appreciate it. Please refer it to all of your friends. We'd love to get more subscribers and more downloads. Have a great day, and thanks for watching and listening.
Thank you for listening to the Landlord Lease podcast. To get your free lease and other training material, visit us at veteranlandlord.com and create your free account. If you find this material valuable, we'd appreciate it if you can share this podcast with others and leave us a great review.